General of the Labour Party.
ערב טוב, תודה לכל מי שבא ובא, ואני יודע שזה גם לפני החגים וזה לא פשוט. אנחנו, few words in Hebrew, your mission. אנחנו מארחים פה היום, יש לנו זכות גדולה לארח את, תסגרו את הדלת שם בבקשה. יש לנו זכות גדולה לארח את ראש ממשלת אירלנד לשעבר, שהיה מספר קדנציות, ועשה משהו שאנחנו פה במזרח התיכון קצת מתקשים לעשות. הוא עשה שלום, הוא פתר סכסוך, ואני אגלה לכם סוד, זה היה סכסוך לא פחות מורכב ולא פחות מדמם מהסכסוך הישראלי-פלסטיני, סכסוך של למעלה מ-800 שנה, שהיה בו הכל, היה בו דם, והיה בו פיגועים, והיה בו שנאה, והיה בו קוטביות, והיה לו את האומץ לעמוד ולהגיד מגיע לעם שלי משהו אחר, יותר טוב, ויחד עם טוני בלר הביא את הסכם גוד פריידיי המפורסם, ואני חושב שברטי אהר, His Excellency, הוא הוכחה לכך שמנהיגות אמיצה יודעת לעשות הסכמים מדיניים, יודעת להביא שלום, ואני חושב שכדאי שגם אנחנו פה נלמד ממנו, וזאת המטרה של האירוע הזה. His Excellency Bertie Ahern, this is a huge pleasure having you here today with us. As you probably heard, maybe we have a conflict here in the Middle East, a conflict that is not yet solved. And part of your mission here today is to tell us a little bit about how did you solve the conflict together with Tony Blair, together with other partners in your region. To tell us if you think that it's possible. I said to the audience that what you had, and I hope that we will have it also here, is a courageous leadership that decided that this conflict shouldn't be managed anymore, but should be conflict. And I think that all of us here is a little envy in Ireland, Northern Ireland and the UK, that you finished your conflict, and we're praying for peace here. And I think that on behalf of all of us, we are saluting you and thank you for your courage, for your leadership, and for ending your conflict. Thank you very much, Prime Minister Ahern. I'm very happy to welcome the head of the Israeli opposition and our chairman, Before Mr. Ahern will talk, I will give Herzog, our leader, the head of opposition, to say a few words. But Bushi, before you came, I said that we are waiting for leadership in Israel that will be and will have the same nature of leadership that Mr. Ahern had in his region. And he did something that we are all dreaming to do here, and this is to solve the conflict. We believe that the man sitting left to you having these qualities, and we hope that this kind of courageous leadership will come from the Labour Party. And by the way, something very encouraging, Mr. Ahern just told us in a conversation that in 97 and 96, Bushi, he still was the head of opposition in Ireland, and Tony Blair was the head of opposition in England, and both of them became the head of states, and both of them solved the conflict, and God, we pray that it will happen also here in Israel with your help. Thank you so much, and I will give our leader Isaac Herzog to say a few opening remarks.
I'll say a word in Hebrew, then I'll speak to you, Bertie, Prime Minister Ahern. ערב טוב לכולכם, חג שמח. אני חושב שהדבר הנכון ביותר זה ללמוד את הלקח והניסיון של החוויה האירית. בדקות אלה ממש נשמעה אזעקת צבע אדום באזור עוטף עזה. זאת המציאות של חיינו. במציאות כזאת צריך להילחם בטרור בנחישות, ללא מורא וללא חשש, כשהאחריות מוטלת על החמאס מצד אחד. ומצד שני, כמובן, לחפש דרכים להיפרד מן הפלסטינים ככל שנשאר מחוברים ולא ניפרד, לצערי ימשיכו לרצח ישראלים. היה גם ניסיון היום ואנחנו חייבים להמשיך לקדם את תוכנית ההפרדה בכל דרך. ואני הצגתי את התוכנית הזאת השבוע לשר החוץ הגרמני, ואמשיך להציג אותה ברחבי העולם ובארץ, לציבור, לשכנע שיש רק דרך אחת, לקדם את ההפרדה מן הפלסטינים ולקדם חזון של כינון ויישום רעיון שתי המדינות. I just mentioned, you know, first of all, for all of you who don't know, I come from an Irish background of sorts. It's known, and my family is commemorated all throughout Ireland, and my late grandfather was the chief rabbi of the Irish Free State and was part of the revolution, and my late father is commemorated in Ireland, and I had the huge honor and pleasure of meeting Prime Minister Ahern in his office in 2004. I then came with the head of the Istadrut, then Amir Peretz, and it was an incredible visit because I've been studying the Irish experience and the Good Friday Agreement, and it was a unique moment in history whereby God-given moment where the leaders, all of them, had the courage and the willingness to go ahead. I've spoken to Jerry Adams at length. I've spoken to David Trimble at length. And I've spoken to Tony Blair at length. And really this was a unique convergence of interest of a moment whereby people laid their hatchets and moved towards peace. And you deserve a huge credit for it, Prime Minister Ahern. We want to learn from your lesson. We dream of the day that we'll be able to do so. During the elections, I told the Israeli public that one of the first things I'll do was to go to Ramallah and try and change the national psyche on both sides. Unfortunately, when I went to Ramallah in August, President Abbas told me there will be a third intifada. And when I came out with it to the Israeli public, and when I came out with it to both him and to Prime Minister Netanyahu, there was no response, and the rest is a tragic history, which started at the end of September, with dozens of Israeli casualties and hundreds of Israeli wounded, including a terror attack today and right now around Gaza. So we want to change this reality, and we are a huge political force, and we are the second largest party in parliament, and we will do whatever it takes to change the course of history. I want to congratulate our friend Hilik Bar, who has been a stalwart advocate of the two-state solution, who's been working tirelessly, who's been presenting a peace plan, which parts of which was converged into the Labour Party platform, which was adopted recently in our conference, including my disengagement separation plan and other elements that Hilik laid down for the horizon of the two-state solution once we get there. This is the basis of what we need to convince the Israeli people not to fear, but to be bold, to try yet again despite the terrible circumstances that we live in. So thank you all very, very much, and thank you for coming and being with us. We look forward to
I would like now for Prime Minister Ahern to tell us in around 10 minutes, because I did promise that we will have a discussion here with the ODF, to tell our friends and activists maybe what was the secret, the essence of being able to reach peace after 800 years of conflict. And after his presentation, we will open the floor for a wider and open discussion. Mr. Prime Minister.
Well, thank you very much, and to the leader of your party, it's a great honour to meet you again and to be with you again. You've said you're highly respected, and your family, and you, in my own country, north and south, and it is great for us to be with you, and we wish you well in all your great work. Secretary General, we thank you for this opportunity. I've had a chance of talking to your Foreign Affairs Committee and to discussing it. So I'm sorry for them if they have to listen to me again, and to my own friends who have worked with me the last few days, but worked so hard here with you to make progress. I will try in a short period, and then maybe take questions if I can give you the history, the short history of my country and the conflict and where the talks went. In the time, I'm not going to be able to go through it in huge detail, so I have to move fairly quick through it. It is a fact in the island of Ireland that we believe we're a beautiful place. We might have too much rain at times, but we're a nice place, and we have beautiful seas and mountains and lands. But the reality is that we've had conflict for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. We had various invasions through history. And no matter where you look and what century, we've had troubles and conflicts, we've had war, we've had mayhem and plundering, and that continued through the generations, whether it was the 11th, the 12th, 13th century or thereon. In 1920s, just moving fast forward, the country was divided, and Northern Ireland was taken under the control of the British. Southern Ireland was set up as an independent republic with our own self-determination. Of course, that didn't solve the problem, and we've had conflict nearly every decade from the 20s through to the 90s. I'm not going to go through the early decades of that period, just to say there was always trouble, there was always conflicts, there was always disagreement. And Northern Ireland is really divided between nationalist people who are Catholics, Republicans, but nationalist people, basically loyal to Dublin, to the Republic. And we have those who are unionist people, who are Presbyterian or Protestants, but look to their allegiance with the British. And many of them had been given land in earlier centuries to come and were placed by the British in Ireland. They never, unfortunately, integrated, and that led to a lot of the conflicts over the years. In 1968, there was the civil rights movement in many places in the world, the United States and France, other places in Europe. And the civil rights movement in the north of Ireland was set up on the basis of people who believed in peace, people who were democratically elected politicians, and those who were from civil society. And they set about fighting for equal rights for nationalist people, and to try to be able to get education for their families, to get housing for those that needed it, to get jobs that were not discriminated against. Northern Ireland, the British had given Northern Ireland their own assembly, their own parliament, Stormont. Those of you who follow these things, and I was talking earlier, I can see many of you know it well. And it was a gerrymandered parliament, so the majority was always with the unionist side, and it was set up that way by the British. The civil rights movement was a peaceful movement, but they were dealt with very harshly by the security forces. They were beaten, some of them were killed, not many at that time, but they were beaten from the streets. Their movement, which was to overcome and to try and get equality and equity, was dealt with by physical force. Unfortunately, but inevitably, that left to the resistance movement moving to a physical force campaign. Pity that happened, but it did. And those on the Catholic Unionist or Catholic side started supporting some of them democratic politics, but others started supporting violence. The same happened on the Unionist side. That trouble went on, and I'm going to go fast forward again till 1997. Every year, hundreds of people killed. Over the period, thousands of people killed, tens of thousands of people named, billions in property damage, no tourism, lack of investment, 60% of young people unemployed in the poorer areas, and huge problems of psychology and people's principles being taken from them, and their dignity being taken from them. There were a few attempts, one in 1974, where the parties tried to make some progress. They did, but it wasn't an inclusive process, and it was brought down quickly. In 1985, something similar happened. The violence continued. A lot of us started with the political parties, and as your leader has said, Sinn Féin and other parties, we tried to start dealing with them to talk about what their problems were. How did they see things? And we called them inter-party talks, where people set their positions down. We then tried to get those that were involved in violence, or their political representatives, and most of them had political representatives, they had a political wing. We tried to get them to call a ceasefire. We said we couldn't make progress until there was a democratic means being operated to try and bring peace. In 1994 we got that. Both sides agreed to it within a few months of each other. The British government then said it had to be permanent. We had a debate about what permanent was. Then the British government said the arms had to be given in before they would talk to them, and that delayed it further. The ceasefire broke down and violence resumed. The IRA bombed London and Manchester, did billions of pounds worth of damage, and unfortunately people were killed and had no cause in the conflict in either Ireland or Britain. They were from neither country. So we had to start again. Your chairman has stated, Tony Blair and I were leaders of the opposition, or respective opposition. I had been finance minister in the governments that had been involved in the earlier talks. We then tried to see what we could do if we were elected to power, and how we could bring things forward if we were elected. He was elected in June 97, or in May 97, I was elected in June 97. We said we would give a few years of hard effort to see if we could get the peace process back on track. And I just quickly moved through. The first thing was to get the ceasefire through. Then it was to get talks started within 6 weeks of the ceasefire, because that was the problem earlier on. The talks were based on openness, providing people signed up to the principles of democratic, peaceful means, of not coercion, of not using violence to force their will, that we would talk to them and they would have a seat at the table. They had to have political representation. If they hadn't got a political wing, we kind of kept them informed, but they weren't. The talks were based on an inclusive process, by giving everybody a chance to put their case, to give their grievance, to give their view of how we could find a solution. Over the months of September to April 1998, we had ups and we had downs. We had some people going back to violence, not from the leadership, but from smaller groups. We have to deal with all those difficulties. I'm not going to go into them, except you need me to afterwards. The agreement was based on an inclusive process first, but secondly, a comprehensive agreement. We dealt with all the issues. The issues of a new police force, a reformed police force, of a new criminal justice system, of dealing with an Equality Act, of giving equal rights to workers, to trying to deal with all the social policies that were causing the grievances over a long period. The British government and Tony Blair, I'd have to say, was a great partner for me to deal with. We fairly well agreed on most things, had our rows and arguments, but never fell out in the discussions. We dealt with prisoners, because there were thousands of people in prisons. We dealt with the issues of arms. How do we deal with the arms that are held by all the illegal groups, whether they were considered by one side as terrorists or freedom fighters, because depending on their perspective, we had to deal with those issues. The agreement was signed up to in April 1998. That's why it was called the Good Friday Agreement, 10th of April 1998, almost 18 years ago, or just gone 18 years ago. We put the agreement to the people of all of Ireland, to the people north and south. Chairman has said the week before, people said, well, you know, you've worked hard, you've done well, but 95% of people said we don't believe that you can resolve this issue. But I think everybody, the parties, the leaders, the people that were involved in the negotiations kept with it. Some people ran away, yes. inevitable, but most stayed, and we brought through the agreement and brought it to the people, and it was passed. For me, the difficult issues were that I had to change the Irish Constitution. The Irish Constitution since 1937 claimed jurisdiction over Northern Ireland. It was my territory according to the Constitution. The British government had the Government of Ireland Act, which said it was their territory. The agreement, and probably the hardest bit for me, was to remove the two clauses claiming jurisdiction over Northern Ireland, and Tony Blair had to remove the Government of Ireland Act. Our compromise was that it was neither Irish or British, it was British and Irish. People could claim their passports, either a British passport or an Irish passport. The British pulled out of claiming their rights, I pulled out of claiming our rights. In future, the principle of consent, only the people in Northern Ireland would vote for any change, and if there was to be any change in the Constitution of Northern Ireland in the future, it would only be done in a democratic election by the people in Northern Ireland. Tony Blair had to deal with very difficult issues, and even he had to deal with the prisoners issue, which was even more difficult than us. We agreed that we would allow all the prisoners out within 2 years, regardless of their crimes. And that was difficult, because we had to speak to the families, try and explain to the families why we needed to do this, explain the difficulties of it, and why we believed that the sides that were involved in conflict were not going to walk away from the prisoners. So that, of course, was a difficult issue. As it happened, I'm not going to dwell too long, except you wanted me to come back on it, but as it happened, the prisoners was not my worry. The prisoners were allowed out. Tony Blair had far more than I had, because they were in northern jails and British jails. They did not create difficulties. They, by and large, were helped the process. They either disengaged and did nothing, or many of them, many hundreds of them, went back to their communities and became persuaders for peace, turning their young people away from violence, engaging in community activities, working with ex-prisoners' bodies, and working in a progressive way to help bring investment and to convince foreign investors and tourists that it was a safe place to work in. And that worked well. Trying to deal with the arms issue was far more difficult. I thought that might have been easier, but maybe we weren't clear enough in the way we rolled it up at the time, but it took us years to deal with the arms issue. They weren't being used, but we had to move to a position where they were beyond use. The leader would know we used many people. We Cyril Ramaphosa helped us in that, Marty Atasardi, John de Chastelain. We used non-Irish people, non-British people to help us to try to deal with the arms issue. Anyway, Chairman, keeping to your time, everyone didn't love each other overnight, but at least the violence stopped. People started working together slowly. They started talking to each other. It took us some years to get the last leader in. He had quite a big part. He didn't come in the first place. He met me many, many times, but wouldn't shake hands to me for 9 years. It's difficult dealing with someone for 9 years and they still won't shake hands to you. But we kept working. In the end, we ended up very good friends. So that was the last of the people we had to bring in. And that allowed us, the agreement allowed for a new representative elected body in Northern Ireland. That was done on the basis of one person, one vote, where there was no gerrymandered constituency, where it was done independently, and where equal representation was given to those people from nationalist and unionist, loyalist, republican positions in Ireland. They had an executive body that were their leaders and dealt with most of the powers. Most of the powers were given back from Britain, from London to Northern Ireland. And even the policing powers and security powers were given back in more recent years. And so Northern Ireland genuinely has their own elected people, they have their own representatives, and they can get on with life. We got a huge amount of investment in once the trouble stopped. Tourism come back. Many of the tourists now spend their time going around the areas that once were conflict areas. Yes, there are still issues we have to deal with. We have still some problems around our educational system and housing system, but it's not around violence. It's around trying to get people to work together, to integrate better, to communicate better, and to share things better. That will take a long time. We have to continue to work on that. As your leader and chairman have said, in any peace process, you do have to take big political risks. I said to the chairman earlier on, if they work, people say well done, and then they move on to the next issue and attack you on the next issue, because that's the way it works in politics. If it doesn't work, you get thrown out. But in my view, it was better for Tony Blair and I and the other people who worked with us, David Trimble and Gerry Adams, Mark McGuinness, and many of the other loyalist leaders, that we actually tried. That we just didn't continue on having violence year in, year out. That all my life from the time I was a child, I listened every day on the radio. The bombs, what happened last night, who was killed during the day, and in the night time what funerals took place. It was the same story, the same news. You could have been unconscious for 2 years and came back, and it was the same news you would have heard. The same horrific stories of lives being lost and of people being lost. And apart from economic and social issues, the biggest issue in any conflict is to bring peace, in my view. And I always challenge people, you know, what's wrong with peace? Why are you afraid of peace? Do you make something out of not having peace? Is there a career by having a violent society? Is that the way you want it? Is that the way you want your children to grow up in a society that is violent? In my view, my humble opinion, I can only talk for Irish peace process, it is better to try to live with your neighbour. In our cases, people genuinely hated each other. They had no time for each other. They killed each other. There were many who did not get engaged in the violence, but they still didn't like the security forces, or they didn't like the way people were handled, or they didn't like the criminal justice system, but they never got involved in actual violence. To try and pull everybody together and to get everyone to work together, it was a better way of doing it. Yes, we have still a small amount of people who don't like the peace. They engage irregularly in terrorist acts, but now they have no public support. The people like Mark McGuinness and Gerry Adams, who used to once be involved in supporting the violence, now condemn these activities. They stand against them. They stand in the middle when there's conflict and put their own lives at risk to say we have to live together and we have to live in peace. Chairman, I look forward to, as best I can, as you'd appreciate, I'm not going to get involved in the political problems of your country in the conflict, because I'm not an expert. I've enjoyed engaging with everybody. I do read a lot, but, and as I said, your leader is an esteemed person in Ireland, and very well known, and people do to keep a watch on what happens in this end of the world. But I always say one thing in any place that I go. I've been involved in conflicts in many countries, officially and unofficially, over the last 6 or 7 years since I left Parliament, 5 years since I left, but even before that I was involved. I do say people have to ask themselves the question always, and it's usually the first question, as I said, but the chairman said don't put it first. So I'd say this, you know, if you want the status quo, if people are happy with the status quo, if governments and parties and individuals are happy with the status quo, well, then you're happy with the status quo. Then you do nothing. And of course, you know what happens when good people do nothing? Life becomes intimate. I am an optimistic person. I never believe that something can't be resolved. I've been involved in conflicts in European level. I was the negotiator of the European Constitution. I've been involved in industrial relations. I was Minister for Labour in my country for 3 times. I believe that it is worth working for solutions. But I do recognise that some people like the status quo. In Northern Ireland, your leader will remember this, we used back in the 70s and 80s, The British used to say we have an acceptable level of violence. You know, only a few people being killed every few hours, and a few bombs every few days, and you know, a lot of people having to get out of the country and people being jailed. And so an acceptable level of violence. And they said that that's fine, an acceptable level of violence. But thankfully they moved from that position. Moved from a position where it wasn't acceptable to have violence, where it's only acceptable to work hard to try and get people to live as free and as fair as we can. Is the peace in Ireland 100% perfect? No, it's not. Is it perfect enough? I think we have to accept that it is, but we must work to make it 100%. I don't think that'll happen this week, next week or next year, but I think it's for us to keep working at that. In the meantime, can I wish you well? It's been a great honour, and I'll answer any questions, it's a great honour to be with the Labour Party and movement here, to be with your people. I admire all that you do. My colleague that's with me, Peter Cassells, he was the leader of the entire Labour movement in Ireland, north and south, and he was a person I worked with dealing with industrial problems, and I think as we deal here looking at these issues, I hope that my colleagues here, I think maybe we get a chance to talk in a few words later, but my colleagues here who tried to help out here as best they can, that maybe we can succeed in doing that too. So I wish you well, but it's an honour to be with you.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister. I think that your words gave us a little hope that maybe something good can happen. Also here, I will open the floor to question in a minute, but I want to start with one simple and very basic question to you, Prime Minister. As you said, in Ireland until today, people are saying that they are not happy with peace, and that they are think that peace is something that they don't want, and they are trying to hurt it. And also here in Israel, Prime Minister, there is a lot of people that will say that this conflict should be managed and not be solved. That we don't have a partner, or not good enough partner, that the incitement and demonization and hatred between the two sides is something that we cannot overcome. We see the hatred and incitement from the Palestinian Authority, and do you believe that this is a working assumption to say we don't have a partner, these obstacles cannot overcome, so that's why we're doomed to either manage the conflict forever or to just give up and understand that we're doomed to fail, or is it not a working assumption, and do you have any words to say about it?
I never believe that something is insolvable, and you don't always have a partner easy. It's a bit like life. It's very hard for a boy or a girl or a man or a woman to have a partner if they don't go looking for one, and usually they don't fall out of the tree. You have to go out and try and find a partner. And I think it's the same a little bit with a peace process. You have to try and work to find partners and to make a way of moving forward. If you take the view, and I'll only talk for myself, I can't talk for your circumstances, but insofar as some things fit the same script, that might be so. But it wasn't easy for the people in Northern Ireland, the people who were the democratic parties who were not involved in Ireland, involved in violence in Ireland. They had to go and work with others and see if they could find a way of dealing with them. And people who were not in violence didn't like the idea of dealing with people that were involved in violence. So you have to go and try and create the conditions. I had a lot of discussions with my colleagues from Forward Thinking who have a very good knowledge here, and We have been talking about, and they've explained to me how things work here. But like, I just give you my circumstance. If Tony Blair and I had decided when we were in opposition or when we were elected to government in 1997 that we had no partner, that we couldn't find anyone to talk to us about trying to build a peace process, then we would have went and just dealt with all of the other issues of the day and allowed the issues to continue. But what's managing the situation? There was a time in Northern Ireland when there were tens of thousands of British soldiers, there was thousands of police. We had, I don't know what you call MI5, MI6, we had all this security. We had tens of billions being spent on the best security. We had part-time defence people working that were armed up to the hilt. And we still had violence every day. And you know, the question is, was that managing the situation? Now we have total security, demilitarisation of the security. There is no army on the streets whatsoever. There's very little army in Northern Ireland. The police are now a reformed policing, 50% from Catholics, 50% from Protestants, and people go about their business. The committees that make up the policing force are now made up of people who used to be involved with parties that were in violence, and that makes sure that things are quieter than ever. So with all the security in the world, we still every day have problems. And if that's managing the situation, well, it doesn't get you very far, and people really didn't want that. So we have to go and find partners and then move it on from there.
Thank you so much. Now, because we don't have too much time, I would like people to ask questions. They don't have statements, okay? Yeah. So, Rafi, please.
First, I want to thank you for your courage, your wisdom, your strength, and your teachings. And I want to give you my admire for what you have done. לאנשי מפלגת העבודה פה ולמנהיגנו, יש לי בקשה אחת תנועה. תרגמו בבקשה את כל המילים שנאמרו בכל סוגי האנגלית האלה. באנגלית, בגלית, באירית, לכל סוגי העברית. מזרחית ומערבית, ימנית ושמאלית. לכולנו יש ילדים, בשביל זה אנחנו עובדים.
תודה, תודה רפי. So Rafi exactly followed my request. Did not have a statement, but a question. Alice, please. Just 10 so the Prime Minister will see you and you can.
Prime Minister, I'm obviously full of admiration for you. I'm one of these Anglos who think that what you did is one of the greatest things in the history of both countries. The quartet doesn't seem to have worked. Have you ever thought of you yourself and Tony Blair taking it on as a project? And the other quick question is, I as a member of the Labour Party am thrilled that you're here. But unfortunately, the people who run this country and are in charge of this heinous occupation are the other party. Are you meeting with these leaders too? Thank you.
So Alice is trying to recruit you to solve our problem.
I thank you very much, but my efforts here are put into helping my good friends and forward thinking who work very hard to try to help. And I will do that.
Okay. Ellie, please.
Sir, thank you again for your words. I wanted to know if you can identify some religious and cultural aspects in your conflict, because I think ours is much more complicated. We have a totally different mentality dealing with Eastern or Muslim world and democratic Western civilization. Did you have any of that as well?
Well, you know, it wasn't a non-European issue. We were the only conflict on in Europe for a long time. But you know, to be honest, when I look back 18 years now, I often look back and like the bitterness and the enmity and animosity and hatred that was in my own country. I often wonder, you know, could it have been much worse? And yes, I've been in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I've been in many other. I've been in Hiroshima. I've been, you know, most places in the world. Lucky enough in a long political career, and I've studied. But it couldn't. I mean, you know, I remember once reading a post-mortem report of an individual that was killed in Northern Ireland. I don't know why I read it. I think maybe it was to try and bring me to my own senses. But the individual had got 298, I always remember the figure, stab wounds. You know, could it be much worse if you were black, you're white, if you were Muslim, if you were Jew, Catholic? I mean, for people who were living in the same small place, in the same small island, to be able to, in the name of something, to do things to other people. And we had a huge amount of those. You know, we used to have a thing called tit for tat. It was murder. And what used to happen was, on a Saturday night or a Friday night, when people, if a Catholic was going with a Protestant, maybe the boy would be leaving the girl home. And they would have nothing to do with trouble, but one was a Catholic, one was a Protestant. So because somebody else had been killed during the week, and they wanted to even up the numbers as if it was a football game, they would just take the boy and shoot him. They wouldn't know his name, but they would know that he was a Catholic going in, or a Protestant going into the other area. And you know, it's savagery or barbaric activity. So I'm not disagreeing with you, but I have to say, I don't accept any conflict anywhere has to live with barbarous acts. So regardless, I mean, if we're all human, therefore humans should try and deal with humans and deal with people. And regardless of what they are, then we should try and deal with that. And that's how I think.
You, and then you. Yes, please. Just say your name.
I do work on the conflict, and I know that in the 80s you have changed the politics of the North Island, the voting, and trying to changing the police from volunteers of the unions to regular police. So I've contributed to this process.
The question is, why did they change the police from volunteers to professional police?
No, I will
did it contribute to the peace process that you changed the police either?
Oh yes,
yeah.
Okay. Yes, definitely. Because I tell you, there's a lot of questions, so I'll try and be brief with my replies. It's not fair on others. The reason being, a lot of people who were totally anti-violence, people who never got involved in violence, and there were many people that didn't, and many politicians who had no time for violence, were peaceful people. They still had major difficulties with the police. They saw the police as being unfair.
Now the police are changing from what's called the union of the... There was like the army of the unions, and it became regular in the end of the 90s, beginning of the 20s. So North Island police.
The transformation from being militia groups to...
Yeah, well, as part of that, the police were totally reformed. And the groups, the people who were involved, we used to call them paramilitary groups, the people who were involved in violence. And they were the people we had to talk to stop the violence. I mean, so those groups all had to be, to stand down, to be disbanded. The political people continued on. I think that's the point that you're making. But the loyalist paramilitary groups and Republican paramilitary groups are no more. But their political representatives, they now follow a democratic Sinn Féin and the Loyalists. They follow democratic politics now.
Thank you, please.
Thank you very much for sharing with us your precious experience. I have a question. What was the role of the media? So first of all, there was actually the ultra-right media, well, newspapers and the television programs which were against the peace process. How did the democratic media aimed at the development of the democratic process manage to overcome all those propaganda tendencies?
Well, I suppose like every conflict, we gave the troubles in Northern Ireland, gave the world media an awful lot of footage and a lot of time. I think by and large the media reported what was happening. I don't think they oversided with one another. Of course, there was criticism with us when we started dealing with people who had been involved in violence. Some of the media were very supportive of that. Other elements of the media believed that it was wrong for me and many others, because it wasn't just me and Tony Blair. There were a group of leaders that worked together for over a long period. And I think that we had a bit of a challenge to convince the media. I said earlier on, I used to always say to the media in press conferences for many years that I would quote Yitzhak Rabin, who said, "You make peace with your enemies, not your friends." So if I was to make peace, it was no good talking to all the people who like me. I had to talk to all the people who didn't.
We have some questions from labor activists over there. Who you are?
Prime Minister, this is really exciting and important to talk about. Look, you had an 800-year-old conflict, which stemmed from religion, but basically started with colonization and settlement activity during Cromwell's time. Now, we tend to compare it to our conflict. We have settlements. Question is like that. Basically, you all agree that there will be no one will move. The two communities will have to grow together. Can you a bit tell us about the psychology of the communities before and after? Before, was there any connection between the communities? Was there any intermarriage? Was there any combined schools, or they just neighbored one street near the other? Because here with the settlements, some of them at least, have a relationship with the nearby villages, and some suffer from terror from the nearby villages. And the question is, I mean, you're telling us, your model, we left everybody intact after a few hundred years. Now they need to grow up together. Now, in the post-agreement, in the period after the agreement, is there any relationship between the communities? Do they meet in school level? Is there any diatribe or hate or hate propaganda between the two communities, or rather they merge together? Is there any business connections? And what happens to the religious leaders? Can you a bit talk about this psychological factor? I will just conclude by explaining it to my friends here. When my grandfather walked in the street during the revolution, he was kidnapped and he was asked, "Are you a Catholic or a Protestant?" He said, "I'm Jewish." So they asked him, "Are you a Jewish Protestant or are you?"
Good question. I think you have a future in the party.
I think there's some people in Northern Ireland might still ask you that. So, I suppose I should say about the settlements in the north. There were settlements that were made hundreds of years ago. There was no continuation of settlements. So the people that were there, that were moved mainly from Scotland to Northern Ireland, have been there for hundreds of years. It wasn't a recurring thing where people were being moved. I think it's like many things in life about the integration. In some places, my brother, his father-in-law was a Catholic, a very strong Catholic, living in one of the most unionist parts of the north. My Irish colleagues know Ballinhinch in County Down. And all around them were Protestants, but they were all wealthier, so they tended to integrate well. Yes, they went to separate schools, but they went to the same universities. They had the same community hall where they could mix. But when you went into the poorer areas, it tended to be not much integration. They played different games. They tended to be divided and more divided. But it was only really certain times of the year, up until the Troubles, it was only certain times of the year that things got hot. And that was around when they started celebrating the Protestant tradition. And I'll try and be fair on this, but the Protestant tradition found it necessary every year in Northern Ireland to have parades nearly every day of the summer celebrating a battle that they won in 1690. And naturally enough, it upset the Catholics. Now, the Catholics weren't without their faults either. They would celebrate the Easter Rising, where we fought the British and fought the Empire in 1916. So, but the tensions would really be around this. Up until the Troubles got really bad and got violent, most people were living well. We do not have integrated education. Education, the management of schools is still run by the religious boards. But increasingly, that's the point I was making about where you'd like to see more progress. They go to schools separately, but when they come to university, they're all in the one university. And they get on quite well, and they act as students, and they serve on student union committees together as Catholic and Protestants. But when they're younger, they tend to be kept a bit apart. In the rural areas, and I drove through some beautiful rural areas yesterday, in Northern Ireland, the rural communities tend to be far closer because farmers need help when they're doing the harvest and the farmers integrate. But in the depths of the city, not so much. But nowadays, I was talking to a promoter of music events last week before last, and he told me now they used to be careful once where they sold the tickets for music events. They would tend to sell the Catholic ones in one shop and the Protestant in. Now they don't have any distinction, and there's no problems. And I don't think people even noticed that they did or didn't do that. So more and more and more, and every year it's getting more integrated. Now, with the one exception is the schools. And in some of the poor housing areas, there's also isolation because people tend to want to live with Catholics or live with Protestants. But as you move up through the classes and the wealthier people, there's no difficulties, and less difficulties. And of course, as I say, the big change in that is, in Northern Ireland in the old days, if you were a Catholic, you couldn't go for certain jobs. If you're a Protestant, you have a far better chance of getting a job. Now nobody asks anyone what religion they are. They don't ask them whether they're Catholic, Protestant, Presbyterian, Jew or Muslim. And I think that is changing and changing, and it's decreasing the bitterness and the identification of origins and nationalities. But it will not end. It's a long process of it's in people's DNA, and I think we have to, because of the violence, it'll take time to change that.
No, I promised. Yeah.
Looking to the future, Britain is debating the possibility of exiting the European Union. And people say, following that, Scotland may decide to go its own way. How might that affect stability in Northern Ireland, and would stability be improved by Irish union at that occasion?
Well, I have to say, I hope that they do not leave Europe. I hope they stay within the European Union. I think it would affect Northern Ireland. It would affect us, obviously, from a business point of view. But the big difficulty for us is, you can cross now from Northern Ireland to Dublin, from Dublin to Belfast. It's only 1 hour and a half. And you will see no security now, no border posts, no army, no police, well, except to catch you for speeding, which they're always trying to do in me. But no political security issues. If you follow the British logic, they say the number one issue is they want total border control. And that means they have to put back in the border. We spent all our lives trying to get rid of them. And now they'll vote to put that back in.
Just a second, we will say goodbye to our leader, Isaac Herzog. And we just want to tell you, we know that we are facing challenges today, and I want you to know that we are behind you and stand next to you and support you. Thank you so much for coming.
Really fascinating. We would love to copy. We envy you. I know that as a leader, you have to face your own people, like all other partners, and tell them the bloody truth and tell them the real truth about what it takes to change the constitution. For those of you who learn Irish history, one of the great leaders of Ireland was murdered for playing with the peace agreement in the original creation of the Irish Free State, Michael Collins, and therefore I think you showed enormous courage by doing this. Thank you very much.
You finish your answer? Who did they go?
No, just about the British team. So I hope they don't. But you are correct. If Britain decide to pull out, I think Scotland have already said, our leader has already said, they will have a referendum probably next year, and I think it will increase the pressures in Northern Ireland to have a referendum. Now, I don't. They're entitled to have a referendum if they want to. I'm personally not in favour of it. I think maybe in the future, but not at this stage. And it will create the difficulties. And you know, I'm on the public record. I've been in debates in Northern Ireland and in London, and I really think it's a big mistake for the British government to pull out, and I hope it's defeated.
Prime Minister, the first time I say that you are a former leader of a beautiful country, which I had the privilege living there for almost a year, back in 2009. They asked me to speak higher, try not to scream and shout. Well, since I live there, and I'm really have a strong contact to Ireland, I know the main point of view and approach of the majority of the Irish people, the press, and the political leaders when it comes to our conflict. And I know you don't want to refer to this conflict in this session, but yet I must ask that how come that a state which had sort of kind of our conflict as well, a lot of violence, a lot of issues, terror as well, and yet they know, you know for sure, that only sitting around the negotiation table will solve the conflict, most of the conflicts. Yet you support, the country, the state supports a lot of the one-sided actions of the Palestinians, including the United Nations, including accepting them as a state. And as well, back in 2009, there was a huge recession in Ireland, but the parliament had a lot of discussion about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it seems that the question is why you're not helping this area reach to the negotiation table to solve it the way you solve it.
Instead of supporting you,
instead of supporting one-sided acts. Yeah.
I think in Ireland, I know if you were to go in the streets in Ireland, the people would say they have a lot of sympathy for the Palestinian cause. I know that, you would have picked that up there. But you know, Ireland, I think, is a fair place, and you know, we had the unique position in 3 political parties. Even though we have a very small Jewish community, the three main parties had a Jewish representative elected to Parliament. We had a Jewish mayor elected Lord Mayor of Dublin. You know, and I think whenever groups come, and I meet groups from both sides, and I know my friends in Forward Thinking work very hard when they bring groups to have people from both sides. I think, quite frankly, where ordinary public opinion looks at conflict, and when they see the conflicts here on TV, they look at how many people are killed. They don't get into the issue. They see 40 are killed on one side, 2,000 on the other side. So, you know, they make up their mind without studying the issues. But I can tell you this, and I wouldn't want to get involved in any conflict, but I can tell you, Irish people are very supportive of a peaceful solution to your conflict. They would love to see a peaceful solution to your conflict.
Can you advise Mazal Shaul? Can you advise us? You mentioned the status quo, and you said that when you came with the agreement to the public was not fond of it at first. So what was the breakthrough that you succeeded to break the status quo and the willing of the people not to give up the status quo? What was the breakthrough from your side?
Tony Blair being elected Prime Minister of Britain.
It's okay. Tal and then Thara. Tal, please, and then Thara.
Yeah, thank you again, Mr. Prime Minister, for this inspiration of your work, your inspirational work in the past. I want to follow up on the question of my friend in the party. By the way, thank you for recognizing Israel unilaterally in 1970, before you recognized Palestine. Yeah, I don't consider it destructive, so I wouldn't consider it destructive to recognize Palestine too, on the contrary. But going to the Irish case, what was the international involvement at the time? How was it perceived? Was there pressure from the external world for the two countries, Britain and Ireland, to move forward? And what did it look like?
No, there wasn't. And, you know, because we have a big support base in the United States, the Irish population in the United States is large, and they're fairly active. And they wanted to see progress, and we had got support from the European Union. But I think most people felt we wouldn't make progress, we wouldn't get there. Bill Clinton, I think, took a more active role for us. He was helpful when we needed him. He sent us George Mitchell, who was on and off with us for 5 years, which was a huge commitment for him to, you know, to move away from his family and spend a lot of time with us. I know he was here for a few years afterwards, but he gave us a lot of time. But I think most people would have said, listen, a lot of your problems in Ireland, your other problems, your economic problems, the fact that we had high unemployment. Like in the early 80s, we had negative growth in our economy. There was no word recession like recent times. We had negative growth in a 7-year period of about 5 or 6%. So we were going backwards. Unemployment was almost 20%. We had very little foreign direct investment. And then as we moved into talks in Northern Ireland and the progress in Northern Ireland, things changed. And we had difficulties in recent years with the international downturn, but that's bounced back again very quickly. So I think where we did get help, I have a view in our situation, if we didn't get help from some of the outside individuals, it wouldn't have helped us. Like, people like Bill Clinton or some of those people could say things to both sides that we probably couldn't say to each other. That's the advantage of outside people, that they don't mind insulting a Catholic and a Protestant in the one day, or trying to convince a Catholic or a Protestant in one day, where if a Catholic insults a Protestant, well then it's meant different. And I think that's where outside help, even-handed people can be. And I think even what I see here and the delegations that have come over to me, I think my friends from Forward Thinking do that very well. You know, they bring groups of all sides and none to Ireland, and they see our experience, or people come here, or I'm here, I learn. You know, I can talk about Northern Ireland, but I learn at the same time. So I think that work of forward thinking of intermediaries is hugely helpful, and I know they appreciate greatly the help of the Labour Party and their interaction with the Labour Party and the Labour movement.
Thank you, Sarah. By the way, Sarah is a psychologist, so you are taking risk by sitting on the couch now. Please.
A very psychological question. I want to know a little bit about the resistance of the public. How did you deal with the resistance of the public? I imagine that the public, the simple person, didn't accept everything. You know, it was a long process. Here in Israel, when Yitzhak Rabin made the attempt to have peace with the Palestinians, he'd been assassinated. People said that he is a traitor. He is, you know, he went against all the rules, all the belief system. So how did you deal with the resistance?
I filed the letters when they sent them to me. You know, you have plenty of people that you know, sit down and write vicious letters about of what they think of you. But we were lucky in that the political system, we kept the political system briefed. We briefed the leaders of the other parties. We told them what we were doing before we did it. We tried to give them the parameters of where we were moving to. On the week of Good Friday, I spent a whole day with the political parties, you know, telling them what I was going to do before I did. So we carried the parties with us, but that didn't stop people feeling that we were selling out, or, you know, particularly people who were against the agreement. And there were not big numbers, but very vociferous people. But thankfully, public support was massive in favour of the agreement. They believed that we got the balances right, providing it worked. If it didn't work, they were prepared to give it a chance. If it didn't work, I think it would have been a different story. But like, say if the prisoners that we left out had all started killing people again, public opinion would have changed rapidly. But I think they gave, you know, that is not just me, but Tony Blair, the other 6 or 7 leaders, the main people involved, probably about 20 in total. They said, these guys are trying, these women are trying, and you know, we support that. And a point that I think we were talking earlier, I just should have said again, civil society was very important in our agreement. The trade unions, Peter's people, the trade unions were very supportive of the peace agreement. Employers were very supportive of the peace agreement. We had a women's coalition, and as I said earlier on, the women's coalition were superb, because the men can be quite mad and the women are sane. So, you know, they were very helpful in talking to community groups and cultural groups. So it all helped. So we had people out in the community who weren't political activists, but were activists of their organisation, and that all helped to make it work over a very long period.
Just short questions and short answers. We don't have a lot of time left, so please.
We are Jerusalem is settled for all the nation Muslims. And also, the terrorists are supported by Iran, which is very far from us, but she supports the Palestinians issue, and they support the terrorists, and also Daesh, with the idea of the golden period, resuming the golden period of the Islams. So, how can you start this process with these conditions? And also, we are the only democratic state in the area.
I'm not going to be tempted to try and resolve your problems for you, but I could just say, do you know where the arms that the IRA used? The IRA were a very well armed group, but they didn't get those arms locally. Gaddafi gave them the arms. So the IRA always had these sophisticated arms. Often they go around the world, people thought that they made them themselves, but Gaddafi gave them to them. So we had our people who were helpful abroad.
Oliver, how much time do we have? 5 minutes. Okay. So please be very short. Sasson, Your
Excellency, if Mr. Abbas, President Abbas, invited you to speak to his people in the same way you are speaking to us, if not, if he will invite you, are you going to be there?
Oh, I will. It's not. I've been in many places in the world over the years, and I've no problems. I will gladly speak to anyone that I thought I could help with, without distinction.
But if he invited you?
Of course.
It's one question.
Of course.
And if there isn't, how did, as you said before, the most difficult part for you was to relinquish jurisdiction of the northeastern part of Ireland? But I'm sure there are people in that part of the world where the affinity for unification is even greater than it is for you.
Yeah, there's a clause in the Good Friday Agreement that any time after 5 years, that if the parties wish to have a plebiscite, they can have the plebiscite. I purposely convince people not to use that too early because we're trying to settle things down. But I think it would be inevitable, back to the question the gentleman said earlier on, if the British pulled out of Europe, it would be triggered. I still would like it if it wasn't for a few years, but you wouldn't be able to stop it if the British pulled out of Europe. But it will someday, definitely you will find a vote, I suppose, someday in the next X number of years, I don't know how long, but the British referendum will definitely trigger it.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Tami Avigdor. I'm from Women Wage Peace Movement in Israel. It's a grassroots movement of 7,000 members from all over, political angles. It's not, we are not belong to any parties. And you mentioned just right now something, the women health. How do you see the women role in resolving the conflict? In your case and in our case, do you think that influence the public to push the government to get to a political agreement is doable? Do you believe in the public power?
He answered about it. He will answer about the women.
Yeah, I think actually you should have a word with my friend Oliver.
You mentioned that women help.
Yes. No, I think you should have a word with my friend Oliver from Forward Thinking, because it is our belief that the women in our case were massively helpful, and that they managed to pull many organizations of people who were involved in politics and none. They were always able to advocate peace, support for their families and their children, and I think women can play a huge part.
What about the negotiation itself? Do you engage women in the
Yes, because there was a group, a women's coalition, who had representative support, and they acted very much between the two sides, and they were really very sensible. I think it's no secret that Tony Blair used to always like to see them coming, because he always felt it would be an easier day.
Yeah, no, I have to give another woman, okay. So please. No, you're not a woman, but...
My name is Emery Burzen. One question I have is, you hear a lot of talk about irreconcilable differences. I remember even in the introductory courses that I took at Harvard in political science, one of the first things we heard was that there's such thing as irreconcilable differences. and the example they gave was in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Is there such a thing as an irreconcilable difference? And if not, how do you get around changing that view, whether it's about refugees or Jerusalem? And if there is, how do you have a peace process with these sorts of issues?
You know, I think people would have said, you were probably with Dan Shapiro in the Harvard conflict. I know Dan very well. And I spoke in your college in Harvard in the conflict resolution section a number of times. But, you know, people would have definitely considered us a place of irreconcilable differences. And I suppose many places are, because it's irreconcilable differences until you reconcile them. And that's the task of people to do. I mean, that's why, as a politician, you're elected. Like, I judge my job, I was elected to try to change things, not just let them continue on as they were. And you know, to do that, you have to try and deal with issues that seem to be protracted or irreconcilable, and see if you can break down those issues. So I don't agree with the notion. I take your point fully, but I don't agree with the notion that anything is irreconcilable. Well, except the fact that I can fly to the moon without anything, you know. But I mean, in normality, I think things are reconcilable. I think things are reconcilable, and it's there was always that famous phrase, you know, are you an optimist, are you a pessimist? I'm an optimist, and sometimes people say, well, I'm a pessimist. And why are you a pessimist? Because I'm an optimist with experience. But I don't agree with that either. I think you have to stay optimistic.
I think it's the last question. If we will have one more time, we'll give it, but please.
Hello, my name is Dara. I'm the vice chairman of MK Hilik Bar, the Middle Israelite and English Israelite. He is friend of Hilik from the OLR. He saw to Hilik that we was the generation that was a witness to the wars, and we are the same generation that was a witness to the Rabin's and Arafat's historical handshake. My question for you is, how do you see the end of this conflict?
Very simple question. How do you fix the war?
Listen, all I can do is wish you well. But can I say this? I don't believe that people should ever give up. If you believe in trying to find solutions of bringing people together. But I have to say this to you, Chairman, and since it's the last comment, I'm a bit confused here in the last few days. When I was trying to bring people together in Northern Ireland from different groups, they were able to get together, the various groups. If people can't get together, if people are kind of boxed in their own areas and they can't meet and get together.
And they have to get up when they come from them.
And then it's very difficult. And I think that seems to me like one of the items on your agenda that you have to deal with, because like if all the things that I say that you must speak to your enemy, that you must keep trying, you must try and convince people, but then you have to get the people in front of you to convince, and I think that seems to be a challenge that you also have to overcome. And I'm not saying to you, I just think generally.
Thank you very much.
Is it a very quick one or?
Very quick.
No. Okay. So first, thank you very much, Prime Minister.